The suitcase fell first. It tipped sideways onto the sand, and a small pink shoe tumbled out, landing near the waterline like something a tide had left behind. I noticed that before I noticed anything else, before I noticed the woman sitting on the bench, before I noticed how still she was sitting, the way people sit when they've run out of places to go. Then I heard the little girl cry, and my heart, the heart that had kept steady through 22 years of building something from nothing, through the death of my husband, through every closed door and empty room that comes without living the life you planned. That heart stopped completely. I stood at the edge of the park path, my walking shoes sinking slightly into the morning sand, and I stared. The woman on the bench was my daughter, Savannah. Her hair was loose and tangled, the kind of tangled that happens when you stop caring about it. Her eyes were swollen, the skin beneath them bruised purple with sleeplessness. She was wearing the same cream-colored jacket I'd seen her in 3 weeks ago over a video call. The call where she told me everything was fine, that work was busy but good, that Lily was sleeping through the night finally, that she would call me back on Sunday. She never called back on Sunday. Beside her on the bench sat 2 suitcases, old ones with scuffed corners and dusty wheels, the kind that have been dragged a long way across surfaces they weren't meant for, and pressed against her leg, one small hand gripping the fabric of her jeans like it was the only solid thing left in the world, was my granddaughter. Lily, 4 years old, with her mother's brown eyes and a stuffed bear tucked under one arm. This was not a visit. This was not a detour on the way somewhere else. I had raised a daughter. I knew the difference between a woman who was passing through and a woman who had nowhere left to go. I walked toward them. The sand was soft. My shoes sank a little with each step. I kept my pace even, kept my breathing steady, kept my face from doing the thing it wanted to do, which was fall apart completely. When Savannah looked up and saw me, the color drained from her face. "Mom," she whispered. Lily turned. She looked at me with those big, careful eyes, the way children look at adults when they're trying to decide if the world is about to get better or worse. I sat down on the bench beside my daughter without saying anything. I didn't ask questions. I didn't reach for her immediately. I just sat and let the sound of the waves fill the space between us and waited. Some truths need a moment before they can be spoken out loud. After a while, Savannah began to talk. She told me in pieces, stopping and starting, dropping her voice whenever Lily looked up. The story came out the way a wound does, slowly, then all at once. 2 days ago, her father-in-law had called her into his office. Richard Caldwell Sr., 68 years old, a man who wore his wealth the way other men wear cologne, invisibly, constantly, in a way that was meant to be noticed. He had married into old Southern money and spent 40 years making sure everyone knew it. He sat on charitable boards, he gave speeches at fundraisers, he shook hands with the right people and remembered the names of their wives. And for 6 years, he had made my daughter feel like a guest in her own life. She sat across from him in his office, the office inside my company, the company I had built from one rented desk in a strip mall in 1999, and he spoke to her the way he always spoke, quietly, pleasantly, like a man discussing a change in the weather. "You don't fit the environment we're trying to maintain," he said. "Our family has a reputation to protect. Your background, your family's background, makes our partners uncomfortable." Savannah told me she tried to respond. She told me she'd brought up her performance reviews, her client numbers, the account she'd grown by 40% in 18 months. Richard had smiled. He slid a manila envelope across the desk. Inside was a termination notice, already processed. Her access badge had been deactivated the evening before. She drove home in a fog. She pulled into the driveway of the house she had lived in for 5 years, the house where Lily had taken her first steps on the kitchen tile, where there were height marks penciled on the doorframe of the hallway. She reached for her keys. The lock didn't work. She tried again and again. Then she sat in the car for a long time, Lily in her car seat in the back, asking if they were going inside, and Savannah couldn't answer her. She called James, her husband, 3 times. It went to voicemail. An hour later, he sent a text message. "I'm sorry. My father needs you to find somewhere else for a while. I'm so sorry, Savannah." That was all. She sat in the car with our 4-year-old granddaughter until it started getting dark. Then she drove to a grocery store and bought crackers and juice for Lily and sat in the parking lot for another hour. Then she drove to the park by the beach, the park Lily loved, the park where Savannah used to come when she was small and the world was too loud. She had been on that bench since morning. When she finished telling me, she was staring at the sand, not crying. She'd gone past crying, into that quieter place on the other side of it. I sat with what she'd told me for a long moment. I let it settle. I let myself feel every piece of it. The fury, the grief, the weight of watching your child be treated like she was disposable. Then I stood up. "Get in the car," I said gently. "Both of you." Savannah looked up at me. "Mom, I don't think you understand. He told me to leave. Not just the job, the house, everything. And James, I understand perfectly," I said. "Get in the car." I picked up one of the suitcases myself. It was heavier than I expected. My hands shook slightly as I lifted it. Not from the weight, and not from age. From anger. The kind of quiet, deep anger that doesn't make noise. The kind that moves slowly and arrives exactly where it intends to go. What I didn't tell Savannah yet, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I already knew something had happened before I saw her on that bench. 2 hours earlier, my phone had changed everything. The morning had started the way most of my mornings do. I woke before the sun, made myself a cup of Earl Grey, and stood by the window in my kitchen, watching the sky turn from black to deep blue, to the particular pale gray that comes just before gold. I liked that hour. It was the only hour that still felt like it belonged entirely to me. Before the emails started, before the calls, before the world remembered I existed and began making demands of my time. My late husband Robert used to tease me about it. "Ellie, no one needs to be awake at 5:15, he'd say, squinting from the bedroom doorway. "The sun is barely convinced it's worth showing up." I smiled at the memory of it. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Patrick Doyle, my attorney of 14 years. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell. I need to flag something before business hours. There's a signed termination notice on file for Savannah Hartwell Caldwell. Company seal, executive signature. Did you authorize this?" I read the message twice. Then I typed back, "No, I authorized nothing. Who signed?" The reply came within 60 seconds. "Richard Caldwell Sr. He used the secondary company seal, the one you granted him temporary access to 18 months ago while you were receiving treatment." I set my phone face down on the counter, the secondary seal. I had granted Richard access to it during a brief period when I was managing a cardiac situation. Nothing serious, a corrected arrhythmia, a few weeks of reduced activity on doctor's orders. Richard had offered to handle minor administrative paperwork. I had allowed it because Savannah had asked me to give him a chance, and because in that moment I was tired and I trusted the wrong instinct. That seal was meant for supply vendor renewals and parking garage contracts. It was not meant for this. I picked my keys up off the hook by the door and left without finishing my tea. I drove toward the park by the beach because that is where my daughter goes when the world comes apart, and mothers know these things about their children the way they know the sound of their breathing in sleep, without having to think about it. When I arrived and saw the suitcases, I understood that what I had feared was real, and I understood something else too. This was not impulsive. Richard Caldwell Sr. did not do anything impulsively, which meant this had been planned, which meant I needed to find out exactly how long and how far the planning went. That evening I made soup, tomato from scratch the way my mother made it, with good bread toasted dark and a little butter. Lily ate 3 pieces of bread and fell asleep at the kitchen table with her head on her arms, her stuffed bear wedged between her elbow and the table edge. I carried her to the guest room, tucked her in, stood in the doorway for a moment listening to her breathe. Then I went back downstairs and Savannah told me the rest of it. She talked for nearly an hour. I didn't interrupt. I refilled her tea twice and I listened to 6 years of small cruelties that had accumulated the way sediment does, slowly, quietly, until the weight of it is impossible to lift. Richard had told her which events she should and shouldn't attend. He'd corrected her pronunciation at dinner parties. He'd introduced her to business associates as James's wife, never by name, never by her role in the company, never as anything other than an attachment. He'd commented on her clothing, her mannerisms, the way she laughed too loudly when she was nervous. "He never shouted," Savannah said, staring into her mug. "It would have been easier if he had. You can defend yourself against shouting." James, she said, had watched all of it happen with his eyes pointed at the floor. Once, just once, about a year ago. He had started to say something at a dinner table when Richard made a comment about Savannah's family. He had gotten as far as "Dad, I think," before Richard turned to look at him, and James had picked up his fork and gone quiet. Savannah had excused herself to the bathroom and stood at the sink for 5 minutes with the water running. She never mentioned it to James afterward, and he never brought it up either. "I kept telling myself it would get better," she said quietly. "I thought if I was patient enough, if I worked hard enough, if I just fit in a little more." "He wasn't going to let you fit in," I said gently. She looked at me. "People like him don't accept," I said. "They audit, and they always find something insufficient because that's how they maintain control." She was quiet for a while after that. When I was sure she had said everything she needed to say, I told her good night. I told her she was safe. I told her not to worry about tomorrow yet. Then I went into my home office. I closed the door. I opened the safe behind the bookshelf, the one that held the original company documents, the ownership records, the financial history going back to the very first year. And I began to read, and I called Gary Whitfield. Gary had been a private investigator for 30 years. I had hired him 3 months ago after noticing a series of financial irregularities in Hartwell Properties' quarterly reports. They were small things, easily explained away individually. A vendor payment that seemed slightly off, a recurring authorization I didn't remember approving, a formatting change in the monthly summaries that suggested someone had been editing documents before they reached me. Small enough to be coincidence, numerous enough when laid together to be something else entirely. I hadn't told Savannah, I hadn't told anyone. I had simply asked Gary to watch and to document and to tell me what he found. He answered on the second ring. "I've been expecting your call," he said. "Tell me what you have," I said. He told me. The picture Gary painted was not small. Over the previous 8 months, Richard Caldwell Sr. had been methodically building what Gary described, in his flat professional tone, as a leadership transition initiative. He had approached 2 members of the Hartwell Properties Board of Directors separately, in private meetings at his club. He had not made explicit promises. Richard was too careful for that. But he had implied, suggested, and maneuvered. He had framed Eleanor Hartwell as a founder whose time had passed. He referenced with apparent concern the cardiac episode 18 months ago. He used the word stability repeatedly across the documented conversations Gary had been able to reconstruct. He had drafted, with his own attorney, a proposal to install James Caldwell Jr. as CEO, with Richard himself serving as senior executive advisor, a title with no formal authority and in practice all of it. And he had prepared a document, not yet filed, not yet circulated, suggesting that Eleanor Hartwell's capacity for executive decision-making had been compromised by age and health circumstances, and that the board had a fiduciary duty to act accordingly. I listened to all of it without speaking. When Gary finished, I said, "How long has he been planning this?" "Best I can tell," Gary said. "He started laying groundwork about 14 months ago, right around the time you gave him access to the secondary seal." I closed my eyes. He saw the health situation as an opening. "Yes, ma'am," Gary said. He moved slowly, carefully. He's been very patient. "So have I said. I thanked Gary. I told him I'd need everything in writing by morning. He said it would be ready. Then I sat alone in my office for a long time, with the original company documents spread across the desk in front of me. Documents that told the complete, unambiguous story of who had built this company, who owned it, and what Richard Caldwell Sr. actually had claimed to. Which was nothing. The loan he'd provided 6 years ago, the one he'd leveraged into an implied partnership, the one he used to justify his presence in board meetings and his use of the company's name in private conversations, had been repaid in full 14 months after it was extended. Every cent, with interest. I had the bank records. I had the signed acknowledgement. He had been operating as though he owned a piece of something that belonged entirely to me, and he had done it with such confidence, such ease, such practiced authority, that no one had thought to question him. That was his first mistake. His second mistake, the more serious one, was firing my daughter, because until that moment, I had been watching, collecting, waiting to understand the full shape of what he was doing before I responded. He had forced my hand, and men who force the hand of a patient woman rarely understand what they've done until it's already done to them. I looked at the photograph on the corner of my desk. It was old, the colors slightly faded. Me at 41, standing in front of the first building Hartwell Properties ever managed. I was wearing a blue blazer that was slightly too large for me, bought on sale because I couldn't afford the one that fit. I was squinting into the sun. I was smiling the way you smile when you know you're standing at the beginning of something. People forget who laid the foundation, I thought. They see the building, then assume it was always there. That is their mistake. I closed the safe. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood for a moment in the quiet house, listening to the sounds of my daughter and granddaughter sleeping safely under my roof. Then I went back to my office, opened my laptop, and began to prepare. At 11 o'clock that night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Eleanor. His voice was smooth, measured, the voice of a man who had spent decades learning how to sound reasonable. I think we can resolve this quietly, between families. You fired my daughter, I said, from my company. It's no longer a family matter. Savannah is a lovely girl, he said, but she was never the right fit for the image we need to project. Surely you can see that. What I see, I said, is a man who used my seal without authorization to terminate an employee he had no authority over. What I see is 14 months of documented behavior I'll be presenting to my attorney in the morning. A pause, very brief, but I heard it. You're upset, he said. That's understandable, but let's not make decisions we'll regret. I don't make decisions I regret, I said. That's always been the difference between us. I ended the call before he could respond, sat back in my chair. Somewhere in this city, Richard Caldwell Sr. was recalculating, repositioning, deciding what to do next. He thought I was a grandmother with a grievance. He had no idea what was coming. And for the first time since that morning, I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the particular steadiness that comes when you stop waiting for the right moment and realize you're already standing in it. I arrived at the boardroom 10 minutes early. That was not an accident. I wanted to sit alone in that room for a few minutes before anyone else arrived, to remember what it felt like to be in that space when it was still mine, before Richard Caldwell had begun moving through it like a man who owned the walls. The boardroom at Hartwell Properties occupied the northeast corner of the 4th floor, with windows that looked out over the city on 2 sides. I had chosen that office myself 21 years ago because of the light. Robert always said I made decisions based on light the way other people made them based on logic. He wasn't wrong. I sat at the head of the table, not one seat down from it, not adjacent. At the head, in the chair that had always been mine, the chair I had occupied for every significant decision this company had ever made. I set my folder on the table, folded my hands on top of it, waited. The door opened at 9:02. Richard Caldwell Sr. walked in like a man arriving at a ceremony held in his honor. He was well dressed in the particular way of men who have spent a lifetime ensuring their appearance communicates authority. Dark suit, silver cufflinks, shoes with a quiet shine. He had 2 attorneys with him and a young assistant who hovered near the door as though uncertain whether she was allowed to breathe. He saw me at the head of the table. For just a moment, half a second, maybe less, something crossed his face. Then the practiced smile returned. Eleanor, he said warmly, as though we were meeting for brunch. Thank you for agreeing to sit down. I did not stand. I did not return the smile. Sit, I said. The warmth in his expression flickered. He pulled out the chair across from me and settled into it, his attorneys arranging themselves on either side. The assistant found a spot against the wall and stayed very still. Richard placed a leather folder on the table with the deliberate care of a man presenting a gift. I think we can clear up this misunderstanding very quickly, he said. Savannah is a fine young woman, but the role she was filling required a particular kind of... You fired her, I said. From my company, using a seal you were given temporary access to for vendor renewals. The decision was in the best interest of the brand. Tell me, I said, what you believe this company is. He paused, recalibrated. A partnership, he said. Between our families, I've brought relationships, connections, influence. The Caldwell name carries weight in this city, Eleanor. You know that. You brought a loan, I said, one that was repaid in full, with interest, 14 months after it was extended. I opened my folder and slid the first document across the table. He picked it up. His eyes moved quickly across the page, then slowed, then stopped. That's not, he began. The bank transfer records are on page 3, I said. The signed acknowledgement of full repayment is on page 5. Your attorney is welcome to review them. One of his attorneys leaned in. Richard held up a hand to stop him. You used my name, I continued, keeping my voice entirely level. You used my silence. You assumed that because I didn't object loudly, I wasn't paying attention. He looked up from the documents. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear yet, but the first recognition that the ground beneath him was less solid than he'd believed. Let's not be dramatic, he said. We are family. You stopped being family, I said, the moment you decided my daughter's bloodline made your partners uncomfortable. His jaw tightened. She married into our name. That comes with standards, expectations. You must understand. What I understand, I said, is that you have been operating inside this company without authority, without ownership, and without my consent for considerably longer than anyone realized. The boardroom door opened behind me. Patrick Doyle walked in. Behind him came Barbara Sinclair, who had managed Hartwell Properties books for 16 years and had the particular gift of delivering devastating financial information in the tone of someone reading a grocery list. Behind Barbara came 2 members of the board of directors, not the 2 Richard had approached, but the 2 he had not yet gotten to. Richard looked at each of them in turn. Then he looked at me. What is this? He said. A meeting, I said. A real one. Barbara spoke first, because numbers are harder to argue with than words. She laid out the ownership structure of Hartwell Properties with the calm efficiency of someone who has spent decades ensuring that facts remain facts, regardless of who is in the room. The company had been founded solely by Eleanor Hartwell. The loan from Richard Caldwell Sr. had never converted to equity. The conditions for conversion had not been met. The loan had been repaid. Richard Caldwell Sr. held 0 shares, 0 voting rights, and 0 executive authority of any kind within the company's legal structure. Richard's attorneys were both writing notes. Patrick spoke next. He outlined the specific violations: use of the company's seal outside its authorized scope, execution of an employment termination without signatory authority, and 14 months of documented behavior consistent with an attempted unauthorized assumption of executive control. This is absurd, Richard said, his voice tight. I have given years to this company, my relationship with this family. Your relationship with this family, I said, is not a legal instrument. One of the board members spoke. Richard, we've reviewed the documents. Your authority here is effectively non-existent. I think you need to hear that clearly. Richard sat back. His attorneys whispered to him. He waved them off. Then he did something I had not expected. He smiled. Not the practiced, pleasant smile of earlier. Something different. The smile of a man who believes he still has one card left to play. You want to talk about what's legal, he said. Fine, let's talk about the future. He folded his hands on the table. I didn't simply remove Savannah from her position, he said. I've been preparing a succession structure. My grandson, James's nephew, 7 years old, Caldwell blood, has been identified as the future steward of the combined family interests. Documents have been prepared. Relationships have been established. The room went very quiet. You are using a 7-year-old child, I said slowly, as a succession instrument. I'm planning for legacy, he said, something you clearly haven't done adequately. I looked at him for a long moment, at the cufflinks, at the practiced ease, at the absolute certainty that legacy was something you engineered rather than something you earned. A child, I said, is not a business strategy. I stood. I gathered my folder. Patrick will send you formal notification within 24 hours, I said. Your access to any Hartwell Properties systems, facilities, or correspondence will be suspended effective this afternoon. You can't, he started. I already have, I said. I walked out of that boardroom without looking back. In the hallway, I stopped, pressed one hand flat against the wall, took a single slow breath. Then I straightened my jacket and walked toward the elevator. Behind me, I could hear Richard's voice rising. I didn't listen to the words. Some noise is simply the sound of something ending. I drove home in the particular silence that follows a necessary confrontation. Savannah was in the kitchen when I arrived, her phone face up on the table, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. He called, she said. James, while you were gone. I sat across from her. She told me the conversation in the careful, stripped-down way of someone reporting facts they haven't yet fully processed. James had been calm. No accusations, no anger. Just the quiet, careful tone of a man who knew he was standing in the wreckage of something he should have prevented. He told her his father had called him after the boardroom meeting. He told her his father wanted him to choose. Between what? She'd asked. Between him and you, James said. She waited. 3 seconds, maybe 4. What did he say? I asked. She looked at her mug. He said he needed more time to think. I didn't say anything. I loved him, Mom, she said quietly after a moment. I really did. I don't know when that stopped being enough. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Love doesn't excuse silence, I said. And silence has consequences. She nodded, slowly, like someone absorbing a truth they'd known for a while but hadn't let themselves finish thinking. Lily wandered in from the living room, carrying her stuffed bear and a crayon, looking for paper. I found her a notepad from the kitchen drawer and watched her settle cross-legged on the floor and begin drawing something with great concentration. After a while, she held it up. It's our house, she announced. Grandma's house. We live here now. Savannah and I looked at each other over her head. Yes, I said to Lily. You do. The next morning, I opened my laptop at 5:45 and found the news waiting for me like something left on a doorstep overnight. A financial trade publication had run a piece. Questions raised over Hartwell properties, leadership amid internal dispute. The article cited unnamed sources. It suggested that Eleanor Hartwell was under informal scrutiny for financial decisions that may have conflated personal and corporate interests. It quoted a source described only as a person with direct knowledge of the company's operations, saying that leadership clarity at Hartwell Properties was at present a matter of serious concern. There were no specifics. There didn't need to be. This kind of article wasn't written to inform. It was written to cloud. Savannah appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd seen it on her phone. People are going to believe it, she said. Some will, I said. For a little while. Mom? Savannah. I turned from the window. Come sit down. She sat. I sat across from her. This is what he does when he loses ground, I said. He makes smoke, because smoke is fast and cheap and it makes people stop moving. But smoke clears. I tapped the table once. Facts don't. What are we going to do? We're going to answer it, I said. With documentation, with testimony, and with the one thing he doesn't have. What's that? The truth, I said. All of it. Patrick called at 8:15. There's a problem, he said. Bigger than the article. I set down my tea. Tell me. A financial transfer was authorized 2 days ago. Corporate account, significant amount. The authorization carries your signature, Eleanor. The silence stretched. It is not my signature, I said. I know, Patrick said. But it looks like yours. Whoever did this was careful. Something went very cold and very precise in my chest. He forged it, I said. That appears to be what happened. Then we need the person who executed it, I said. Not the document, the person. That afternoon, Gary Whitfield sent me 2 names. Former staff members who had left Richard's employ within the past year. One had signed a non-disclosure agreement with penalties attached. The other had departed quietly, without severance, after 8 years of service. I sent a message to the second name. That evening, my phone buzzed. I know what he did. I know who made the changes to the document. If you can protect me, I'll tell you everything. But I need to know I'm safe first. I read the message 3 times, then I typed back. Name the place. I'll be there. I don't break promises. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then, Linden Street Cafe, 7 a.m. If I see anyone else, I'm gone. I set the phone down on my desk. Outside, the city had gone quiet in the way it does after 10 o'clock. The particular quiet of a place that has stopped performing and is simply existing for a few hours. I sat in my office with the lamp on and the rest of the house dark and still around me, and I thought about all the ways things could go wrong tomorrow. I made myself think through each one. I made myself sit with the discomfort of not knowing, because discomfort, in my experience, is simply the feeling of being honest with yourself about uncertainty. Then I went to check on Lily. She was asleep on her back with her arms thrown wide, the stuffed bear wedged under her chin, her mouth slightly open. She was breathing in the deep, uncomplicated way of children who still believe the adults around them are handling things. I stood in the doorway for a long time. "We're handling it," I said quietly, to no one in particular. Then I turned off the hall light and went to prepare for the morning. The Linden Street Cafe was the kind of place that existed specifically for conversations people didn't want overheard. Small, slightly dim, with tables pushed far enough apart to feel private. I arrived at 6:50, chose a table near the back wall with a clear sightline to the door. Ordered tea, didn't touch it. At 7:04, the door opened. A woman walked in, mid-50s, simply dressed, with the kind of careful stillness that comes from years of making yourself unnoticeable in rooms full of powerful people. She scanned the cafe once, saw me, and paused for just a moment before walking over. She sat down without taking off her coat. "Dorothy Stanton," she said. "People call me Dot. I worked for Richard Caldwell for 6 years." "I know," I said. "Thank you for coming." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup as though she needed something solid to hold on to. "He told me you'd approved it verbally," she said. "He said the written authorization was just a formality, that you'd already agreed, that he needed it processed before end of day." "Did you believe him?" I asked. She looked down at her cup. "No," she said. "But I had a confidentiality agreement, and he reminded me of it very specifically when he asked me to make the changes." "What kind of changes?" "To the transfer authorization document. The original had a blank signature line. He told me to fill it in. He told me exactly how your signature looked. He had a sample. He stood there while I did it." "Do you have proof?" I asked. She reached into her bag and set a small USB drive on the table between us. "Everything," she said. "The original document before it was altered. Emails from him with instructions, timestamps, and a recording. He called me afterward to confirm it was done. I didn't say much on the call, but I had my phone recording." "Why are you doing this?" I asked. Her eyes filled. She blinked it back with the practiced restraint of someone who has learned not to cry in professional situations. "Because of something he said," she told me. "Last week, he was on the phone with someone, and I heard him say that once the company situation was resolved, the next step involved the child, your granddaughter. He said she stopped. He used the word leverage, and I went home that night and I couldn't sleep. I've been trying to decide ever since." The word sat between us like something that had been left out in the open too long. "That crossed a line I couldn't uncross," Dot said. I picked up the USB drive and held it for a moment. "You won't stand alone in this," I said. "I'll make sure of that." She nodded. Then she stood, gathered her coat, and left without looking back. I sat alone at the table with the drive in my hand and my untouched tea cooling in front of me. Somewhere across the city, Richard Caldwell Sr. was recalibrating again, convinced that he was still managing the narrative, still controlling the shape of what was happening. He didn't know about Dot, he didn't know about the drive, and he had no idea that the person he had underestimated most, not me, but his own son, was about to make a decision that would change everything. The courtroom smelled like wood polish and old paper, and the specific gravity of rooms where consequential things happen. We arrived together, Savannah and I, Patrick walking slightly ahead to manage the reporters gathered on the steps outside. There were more than I expected. Richard had clearly been working the phones, ensuring that whatever happened inside would be filtered through the version of events he'd already begun circulating. I kept my hand on Savannah's arm as we climbed the steps. "Don't look at the cameras," I said quietly. "Look straight ahead." She did. Her jaw was set. She looked more like me than she usually does in moments like that. The resemblance that emerges not in features, but in the way a person chooses to carry themselves when the world is watching. Inside, Richard was already seated at the opposing table. He looked composed and confident, his attorneys arranged around him like a well-rehearsed formation. He glanced at us as we entered, and I watched his eyes move to Savannah with something that might have been satisfaction. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Wainwright, 63 years old, 18 years on the bench, with a reputation for patience and a complete unwillingness to be managed. Richard's attorney spoke first. He was skilled. He built a careful architecture of concern, a worried grandfather, a fractured family, an elderly founder whose recent health challenges had raised reasonable questions about her judgment. He mentioned the governance uncertainties without specifying them. He expressed deep concern about the stability of the environment in which a 4-year-old child was currently residing. He was smooth and measured and entirely unconvincing to anyone paying close attention. Savannah's hand tightened on the table beside me. Then Patrick stood. He didn't raise his voice. He never does in courtrooms. He says the room does the work for you if you give it accurate information and enough silence. He laid out the timeline. The termination, unauthorized. The seal, misused. The 14 months of documented positioning. Gary Whitfield's report entered into evidence. Then he looked at the judge and said, "We would like to submit additional documentation, Your Honor, including forensic analysis of a financial authorization that bears Mrs. Hartwell's signature, a signature she did not provide." Richard's attorney was on his feet immediately. The judge heard the objection and dismissed it. She wanted to see everything. As the documents were submitted, I watched Richard. He sat very still. His attorney spoke into his ear, but he wasn't responding. He was watching the judge read. And then came the moment I had not choreographed, had not arranged, had not seen coming. James Caldwell Jr. stood up. He was sitting in the gallery, a few rows back. He hadn't spoken to any of us beforehand. He had simply shown up, alone, and sat quietly. And now he was on his feet with the particular expression of a man who has made a decision that will cost him everything he thought he needed. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to make a statement." The room turned. Richard half rose from his chair. "James, please sit down, sir," Judge Wainwright said in a tone that left no room for interpretation. James was granted the floor. He stood with his hands at his sides and spoke in the careful, deliberate voice of someone who has been rehearsing this, not in front of a mirror, but in the privacy of his own conscience. "My father planned this," he said. "The termination, the timeline, the transfer. He told me if I stayed quiet, everything would be easier. He said Savannah would understand eventually." He paused. He did not look at Richard. "He told me that Lily, our daughter, would be better raised within the Caldwell family structure, that her mother's influence was limiting her potential. He said it so many times and so calmly that I almost..." He stopped, swallowed. I almost believed it was coming from concern. Savannah made a sound beside me, very small. I kept my hand steady on the table. "It wasn't concern," James continued. "It was control. And I stood by while my wife was dismantled piece by piece, because standing by was easier than standing up." His voice broke just once. "That is my shame. It belongs to me, but I won't let it belong to my daughter." The judge made a note. She asked James 2 clarifying questions, which he answered directly. Then she called for a recess. In the hallway, a reporter stepped toward me. "Mrs. Hartwell, is this about revenge?" I stopped, turned to face her completely. "This," I said, "is about responsibility. And the difference between those 2 things is exactly the point." Then I walked back to where Savannah was standing against the wall, her arms wrapped around herself, tears running silently down her face. "He showed up," she said. "He actually showed up." "Yes," I said, she said. "Is it enough?" she asked. I thought about Dot's USB drive, already in Patrick's hands. I thought about the recording. I thought about 14 months of documentation and a judge who had just watched a man stand up in her courtroom and tell the truth at considerable personal cost. "Let's go back inside," I said. When Dorothy Stanton walked into that courtroom and raised her right hand, Richard Caldwell Sr.'s face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It simply went blank. Not angry, not calculating. Blank. The way a screen goes blank when the power fails. As though every practiced expression he'd spent decades perfecting had suddenly, completely run out. Dot testified for 40 minutes. She was precise, unhurried, and entirely credible. The recording was played. Richard's voice filled the courtroom, calm, directive, specific, instructing his assistant to complete a forged authorization on behalf of a woman who had never agreed to it. When Dot finished, the judge looked at Richard directly for a long moment. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "this court will be recommending a criminal investigation into the matters of document falsification and coercion. Temporary custody of the minor child remains with her mother. All third-party involvement in Hartwell Properties matters is suspended pending full legal review." She gavelled the session closed. Outside, the afternoon light was sharp and low, the kind of autumn light that makes everything look very clear and a little cold. Savannah stood on the courthouse steps and breathed. "Is it over?" she asked. I looked at her carefully. I knew it wasn't, not completely. Men like Richard don't end in courtrooms. They regroup. They find new angles. They stop when there is genuinely nothing left to move. But that was a conversation for another day. The worst of it is, I said. She nodded slowly. Then she looked up at the sky, and I watched something shift in her face. Not happiness yet, not relief exactly, but something quieter and more durable than either of those. The particular look of a woman who has remembered she is capable of surviving. "Let's go home," she said. "Yes," I said. "Let's." I did not tell Savannah about the clause that night. Some truths need timing. You learn that, after enough years of making consequential decisions, that the right information delivered at the wrong moment can do more damage than silence. Savannah had been through 2 days that would have broken most people. She had sat in a courtroom and listened to her marriage be examined in public. She had watched her husband stand up and tell the truth at a cost she didn't yet fully understand. She had come home and held Lily through dinner and bath time and a bedtime story about a rabbit who found her way home through a dark forest. And when Lily finally fell asleep, Savannah had simply sat on the edge of the guest bed for a long time, staring at nothing. I brought her tea, sat beside her, let the quiet be what it needed to be. When she finally went to sleep, I went to my office. I opened the safe for the 3rd time in 4 days. Behind the ownership documents and the financial records in Gary Whitfield's report, there was an older file, the oldest one. The original incorporation documents from 1999, bound in a manila folder so worn at the corners it had gone soft. I had not opened this file in years. I had not needed to. I opened it now. The clause was on page 11, standard language for its era, the kind of boilerplate that gets inserted into founding documents by attorneys who are being thorough without being particularly imaginative. I had read it once, 22 years ago, and filed it away in the category of things that would never apply. In the event of a contested leadership dispute materially affecting the company's continued operations, temporary executive authority may be transferred to a managing party designated by consensus of no fewer than 2/3 of the sitting board of directors. 2/3 consensus. I sat with that for a long time. Richard had been approaching board members for 14 months. Gary's report had identified 2 confirmed contacts. There were 8 members on the Hartwell Properties board. 2/3 was 6 votes. He had 2 confirmed, possibly 3, if conversations Gary hadn't fully documented had progressed further than suspected. I needed to know exactly where each remaining member stood. Tonight, before Richard had another 12 hours to work with. I picked up my phone. It was 11:20 at night. I called anyway. In my experience, the people worth trusting are the ones who pick up when it matters, regardless of the hour. I spoke to 6 board members before midnight. Not to lobby, not to persuade. I don't operate that way, and the people who have worked with me long enough know it. I called to inform, to give each of them the complete, documented picture of what had been happening inside their company without their knowledge, and to let them make their own decisions from a position of actual understanding rather than manufactured uncertainty. Most of the conversations were short, a few questions, a long pause, then, "I'll be there in the morning." The 4th call was harder. Harold Briggs had been on the Hartwell Properties board for 9 years. He was methodical and fair-minded and deeply uncomfortable with conflict, which made him exactly the kind of person Richard would have targeted. When I reached him, he was quiet for a long time after I finished speaking. "Richard came to see me at the club 3 months ago," Harold said finally. "I know," I said. "Gary Whitfield documented the meeting." Another long pause. "He said the health situation had affected your judgment, that you were making decisions based on emotion rather than—" "Harold," I said, "in 22 years, have you ever seen me make a decision based on emotion?" The silence stretched. "No," he said quietly, "I have not." "I'll have the full documentation on the table tomorrow morning," I said. "I'd like you to read it before you decide anything." "I'll be there," he said. When I finished the last call, it was 12:40 in the morning. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Through the wall, I could hear the particular silence of a house where children are sleeping. A silence with a different texture than ordinary quiet, fuller somehow, more purposeful. I stood up, stretched, and went to make myself another cup of tea. Richard had scheduled his meeting at the old building for 10 o'clock. I knew about it because Barbara Sinclair had been copied on the calendar invitation. Richard had been using the company's internal scheduling system as though it still belonged to him, which said something about the degree to which he had simply stopped distinguishing between what was his and what was not. The original Hartwell Properties building was on Clement Street, 8 blocks from where I'd signed my first commercial lease in the winter of 1999. The building had been renovated twice since then, but the bones of it were the same. The narrow lobby, the high ceilings, the particular way the afternoon light came through the east-facing windows and made the old hardwood floors glow. I had signed my first client contract in that building. I had called Robert from the parking lot afterward, crying from relief and terror in equal measure, unable to explain to him over the phone exactly what had just happened, only that something had begun. Richard had chosen this location deliberately. Men who operate through symbols understand the power of them. He wanted to stand in the room where I had started and present himself as the next chapter. I drove there alone. No Patrick, no Barbara, no announcement. I walked in at 9:52. Richard was already there, arranging himself at the front of the room with the ease of a man who has spent a lifetime commanding spaces. Several people were seated, 2 junior board members, 2 department heads, Richard's own attorney, and the assistant who always hovered near the door. When Richard saw me, something moved across his face too quickly to name. "Eleanor," he said, recovering smoothly. "I wasn't aware you'd been informed of this meeting." "I own the building," I said pleasantly, and took a seat. He proceeded anyway. He was too committed to stop. He spoke about uncertainty and stability and the importance of clear leadership in difficult transitions. He spoke about legacy and vision and the necessity of protecting what had been built. He used the word family 7 times in 4 minutes, which is what people do when they have run out of facts and need something that sounds warm. Then he produced the founding document, page 11, the consensus clause. "Given the current climate of uncertainty," he said, "this provision exists precisely for situations like this one. I am formally requesting that the board designate a managing executive to provide continuity while the legal matters are resolved." He looked around the room with practiced confidence. "I would like to put forward James Caldwell Jr. for that role." Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I stood up. "I'd like to respond to that," I said. I set a stack of papers on the table, individual sheets, each one signed, each one dated from the previous evening. 8 members sit on this board, he said. "The clause requires 2/3 consensus for a transfer of executive authority. That is 6 votes. I spread the signed statements across the table. These are written confirmations of board position, executed last night. All 8 members have confirmed their stance." I looked at Richard. 8 out of 8, I said. "There is no contested leadership situation. There is no uncertainty requiring intervention. There is only a man without authority standing in a room that doesn't belong to him, requesting powers he has never possessed." The room was very quiet. Richard's attorney leaned toward him and spoke in a low voice. Richard didn't respond. He was looking at the signed statements with the expression of a man watching the last exit close. Then his phone buzzed. He looked down at it, read the message. "Read it again." The color left his face entirely. "His personal accounts," Patrick said from the doorway. He had arrived quietly, 2 minutes earlier, and no one had noticed. "Have been frozen by order of the court, pending the criminal investigation announced this morning. The order was executed 40 minutes ago." Richard put his phone in his pocket. He straightened his jacket. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not anger, not calculation, but something underneath both of those things. Something raw. "You did this," he said. His voice was very quiet. "No," I said. "You did this." I simply stopped letting it continue. He walked out without another word. His attorney followed. Harold Briggs, who had driven 40 minutes to be here on a Wednesday morning, looked at me across the table. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "Your continued good judgment," I said, "which is all I've ever needed." I was halfway home when Savannah called. The sound of her voice told me everything before she said a single word. "Mom," barely a whisper. "He's here." "Where?" I said, already changing lanes. "Outside. He's just standing there, outside the house, looking at the door." "Is Lily?" "She's inside. She's safe. But Mom, he won't leave and I don't know what to..." "Call the police," I said, "right now. While we're talking, I'm 12 minutes away." "Mom?" "Savannah, call them now. I'm coming." I pressed the accelerator down and watched the speedometer rise, and thought about nothing except the distance between where I was and where I needed to be. The police arrived before I did. When I pulled into the driveway, 2 patrol cars were parked at the curb, their lights washing the front of my house in slow rotations of blue and red. Richard was standing on the sidewalk speaking to an officer. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening. He was doing what he always did when cornered, performing calm. Savannah stood on the porch with Lily pressed against her side, the stuffed bear clutched to the little girl's chest. When Lily saw me get out of the car, she lifted one hand in a small wave. I walked to them first. "I'm here," I said, and put my arms around both of them. "He just stood there," Savannah said against my shoulder, "for almost half an hour, just looking at the door." One of the officers approached me. He explained that Richard had refused to leave when asked, had claimed he had a right to be there as a member of the family, and had made a statement that the neighbors who'd called it in had found concerning. "What did he say?" I asked. The officer checked his notepad. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "If I can't control the future, no one will." I stood with that for a moment. "He said that in front of witnesses?" I asked. "4 of them," the officer confirmed. I looked across the yard to where Richard stood by the patrol car, still managing his expression, still performing the part of the reasonable man who had simply been misunderstood. He caught me looking. His eyes held mine for a long moment. I didn't look away. After the officers had taken statements and issued Richard a formal warning, he was escorted to his car. He drove away without looking back. The street went quiet. Lily, who had been very serious and very still through all of it, looked up at me. "Grandma," she said, "why was that man standing there?" I crouched down to her level. "Because he forgot something important," I said. "What did he forget?" "That this isn't his house," I said. "This is ours." She considered this with the grave thoughtfulness of a 4-year-old processing something complex. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and held her stuffed bear out toward me. "Benny needs a hug," she said. He was scared. I hugged the bear with appropriate seriousness. "Benny is very brave," I told her. Lily approved. We went inside. 2 days later, Richard Caldwell Sr. turned himself in. The warrant had been issued the morning before: document falsification, misuse of corporate authority, coercion of an employee, and making threatening statements in front of witnesses. Patrick called me when it happened at 7:15 in the evening. He walked in with his attorney, Patrick said. No statement to the press, just walked in. I was in the kitchen making dinner. Lily was at the table drawing. Savannah was at the counter slicing tomatoes, and for a moment the 4 of us existed in the kind of ordinary quiet that I hadn't realized I'd been afraid we might never find our way back to. "Thank you, Patrick," I said. "It was your preparation," he said. "Every piece of it." "It was a lot of people," I said. "Dot Stanton, Gary, the board, James." "And you," Patrick said firmly. "Don't minimize it." I thanked him and ended the call. Savannah looked at me from across the counter. She had heard enough to understand. "It's over?" she said. "The acute part is behind us," I said. "There will be proceedings. Legal matters take time. They always do. But the worst of it is done." She nodded slowly. Then she turned back to the tomatoes, and after a moment her shoulders dropped. Just slightly, just enough, in the way that bodies do when they finally release something they have been bracing against for a very long time. Lily looked up from her drawing. "Can we have soup?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "We can have soup." James came one final time, 3 evenings later. He didn't call ahead. He knocked, which was more than Richard had done. When Savannah opened the door, he stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had rehearsed something and then decided the rehearsed version was dishonest. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said. "I just needed you to know. I ended it. With my father. With everything connected to how things were." Savannah leaned against the door frame. "You ended it too late," she said. "I know," he said. "You watched it happen for years," she said. Not with anger. She was past anger. With the clear, undecorated honesty of a woman who has stopped softening her truths for other people's comfort. "I know that too," he said. They stood looking at each other for a moment. 2 people who had loved each other the way young people sometimes do. Completely, and without quite enough wisdom to protect what they built. "I won't fight you," James said. About any of it. Custody, the house, any of it. I just want to be Lily's father. Properly. When she's ready. When you think it's right. Savannah was quiet for a long time. That's not my decision alone, she said finally. When she's old enough to have a say, it'll be hers. He nodded. He looked past Savannah into the house toward the sound of Lily singing something tuneless and cheerful from the living room. She sounds happy, he said. She is, Savannah said. She's resilient. She got that from somewhere. He smiled, briefly, carefully, and then he turned and walked down the porch steps and got into his car and drove away. Savannah closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the knob. Then she straightened and walked back toward the living room, toward the sound of her daughter singing. I watched from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. Some moments are complete without commentary. The legal proceedings took longer than the headlines suggested. These things always do. Richard Caldwell Sr. accepted a plea agreement several weeks after turning himself in. The terms were not made public in their entirety, but the professional consequences were clear enough. His name was removed from every board, every committee, every charitable organization he had spent 4 decades cultivating. The philanthropic legacy he had constructed with such care, the library wing, the scholarship fund, the annual gala, continued without him, because institutions, unlike reputations, are designed to outlast the people who build them for the wrong reasons. His name faded from the news with a speed that might have surprised him if he were still the kind of man who expected permanence. I thought about him once, about a month later, standing by my kitchen window watching the yard. I thought about the particular blindness of people who confuse access with ownership, who move through spaces built by others and gradually, almost unconsciously, begin to believe that their presence means the place belongs to them. I didn't hate him for it. Hatred requires sustained attention, and I had better uses for mine. I thought about him for approximately 90 seconds. Then Lily ran into the kitchen asking me to help her find her other shoe, and I stopped thinking about him altogether. Hartwell Properties had its strongest quarter in 11 years. Barbara Sinclair presented the numbers at the board meeting that November. Steady, clear, unambiguous. Harold Briggs caught my eye across the table and gave me a small, approving nod. After the meeting, I stood alone in the boardroom for a few minutes, looked out the northeast windows at the city in the late afternoon light. 22 years. 1 rented desk, every door that had been closed, every moment when the rational choice would have been to scale back, to accept a smaller version of the vision, to let someone else's certainty replace your own. I had not done the rational thing. I had done the persistent thing. In my experience, when they're in conflict, persistence wins. I turned off the boardroom light and took the elevator down. 6 months after the morning, I found my daughter on that bench with 2 suitcases and a little girl in a pink shoe. I went back to the park. It was a Saturday morning in early spring, the kind of morning that feels like a gift, not because anything dramatic is happening, but because the light is exactly right and the air has that quality of possibility that belongs to the season before the heat settles in. Savannah was already there when I arrived, sitting on the same bench, the same view of the water, but entirely different in the way that the same landscape is different when you are standing in it rather than drowning. Lily was on the sand, running, not toward anything, not away from anything, just running, the way small children run when the world is big enough and safe enough to simply move through it for the joy of movement. Her shoes were on, both of them, the same little pink ones, laced up carefully. She was laughing at something only she could see. I sat down beside Savannah. We were quiet for a while, watching Lily zigzag across the sand toward the water's edge and back again, collecting things, a shell, a piece of sea glass, a particularly interesting stick. I think about that morning sometimes, Savannah said, when you found us here. So do I said. I was so ashamed, she said. I kept thinking, she's going to look at me and see someone who let this happen. I turned to look at her. What did you see when I sat down? She thought about it. You didn't look disappointed, she said slowly. You looked like you'd been expecting me, like you already knew where to find me. I did, I said. You always come back to the water when things get hard. You have since you were 5 years old. She laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that happens before you decide whether or not to let it. You never told me you knew that. Some things are more useful unannounced, I said. She shook her head, smiling. Lily came running back with both hands cupped around something. She skidded to a stop in front of us, slightly breathless, enormously pleased with herself. "Look," she said, opening her hands. In her palm was a smooth gray stone, oval and flat, the kind the water works on for a very long time to get exactly right. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said. I looked at it with the full seriousness it deserved. "That," I said, "is the finest stone I have ever seen." Lily beamed. She considered it for a moment, then held it out to me. "You can have it," she said, "for your collection." "I don't have a collection," I said. "You do now," she said, with the absolute authority of a 4-year-old establishing facts. I took the stone, held it in my palm. It was warm from her hands. Lily ran back toward the water. Savannah and I sat in the morning light and watched her go. "She's going to be all right," Savannah said quietly. "Yes," I said. "We all are." I closed my fingers around the stone. "Yes," I said again. "We are." The water came in and went out, the way it always has, indifferent to the particular dramas of the people who stand at its edge. Lily laughed at something, and the sound of it carried back to us on the wind. I sat on that bench in the spring morning light, a warm stone in my hand and my daughter beside me, and I thought about the 22 years it had taken to build something worth protecting, and the 4 days it had taken to protect it. I thought about the photograph on my desk, the young woman in the too large blazer, squinting into the sun, standing at the beginning of something she couldn't yet fully see. I thought about what I would say to her, if I could. "Keep going," I thought. "It is worth it. All of it. Even the parts that feel impossible. Especially those. The foundation holds." Lily came running back one more time, her arms full of shells and sea glass and sticks and all the beautiful ordinary debris of a morning at the beach. Too much to carry, unwilling to leave any of it behind. That seemed right to me. That seemed in fact exactly right. I stood up to help her carry it home.